Welcome to this talk and the Q&A that we've been very much looking forward to by Astrida Neimanis, How to Think as a Body of Water, Access, Amplify, Describe. My name is Rebekka Seubert, and I'm the Artistic Director of the Dortmunder Kunstverein. So now I'd like to give a warm welcome to Astrida Neimanis and to the artist José Montealegre, who I co-curated this exhibition with. Thank you so much for being here tonight, and we're very curious to hear your talk right now, How to Think as a Body of Water, Access, Amplify, Describe.
Thank you so much, Rebekka and José, for this invitation. I am Zooming to you today from the unceded territory of the Syilx people here in the interior part of BC, British Columbia, Canada. So for this talk, I am actually revisiting some old writing. It's from Bodies of Water, from that book that Rebekka was just mentioning. And actually, I'm just going to pop into the chat here. This is how you can access a free open access copy of the book. I'm not doing that to self-promote, but because the publisher, Bloomsbury, hides the free copy very well, so people have trouble finding it. So you don't have to spend money on it. You can go and read it there. And the talk today is taken from chapter 1 of the book. And as I mentioned, it's rather old now. You know, actually it came out of my doctoral thesis work that I was doing, you know, like 2006, 2007. So, 15 years ago. But I revisited it for today, going back to my watery roots, so to speak, to think about method and to think about what I do as a cultural feminist theorist that is actually what I consider a kind of practice-based philosophy. And I kind of want to share that with you today. And it really does go to this question that Rebekka mentioned about the status of the individual. I hope that the talk isn't too academic. It does mention, it mentions quite a few times the philosophical practice of phenomenology, and in particular, the work of mid-20th century French phenomenologist Maurice Merleau-Ponty. It also briefly mentions the work of French philosopher Gilles Deleuze and his concept of the virtual, and also Donna Haraway's work and her concept of situated knowledges. But even if you don't know these works and aren't familiar with these thinkers, I'm hoping the talk will make sense nonetheless. It's really about the practice and not about the theories. But if you do want to look up those references or read more about them, you can find them in chapter 1 of that book that I just popped into the chat. Okay, without further ado, let's begin. This talk is 40 minutes, and I want to make sure we have time for questions and discussion afterwards. So how to think as a body of water, access, amplify, describe. We are the watery world, metonymically, temporarily, partially, and particularly. Water irrigates us, sustains us, comprises the bulk of our soupy flesh. To be a body of water, then, is neither a speculative fiction nor a thought experiment, but a very complex description of the way that we live as bodies, and specifically as wet and leaky ones. Bodies of water is what I call a feminist posthuman figuration. So it's a concept or an image that surfaces from deep attentiveness to the ways in which I am embodied, and to how this embodiment matters in and as the world. This concept, bodies of water, emerges by parsing all kinds of different forms of knowing and knowing water, literary knowledges, philosophical ones, scientific ones. But all of these travel through the sensory apparatus that is our watery, never quite contained flesh. So this philosophical practice is always moving through my watery body. What results is a thick, saturated description of lived embodiment. A question remains, though. How can this idea or this concept, bodies of water, be activated as a way of living as a body of water? How can we experience this concept in and as watery, fleshy beings? This question is grounded in my conviction that all theory, all philosophy is material. Concepts only make sense to us because we can experience them bodily, even when those experiences are very distant or small or large or too intensive to easily grasp at the surface, where we take what phenomenologists would call the natural attitude. So for phenomenology, the natural attitude is just a kind of everyday human way of being in the world. Our bodies as sensory apparatuses must sometimes stretch or contract in order to really access the materiality that a concept or a theory proposes to us. Yet I still maintain that all theories and all concepts are nonetheless lived by us somehow. To describe the world as it is lived is the work of phenomenology. The tagline of phenomenology is go back to the things themselves. But in order to account for the ways in which a watery perspective torques and twists our understanding of embodiment, I think we need a different kind of phenomenology. Not the one that I, learned and read about that comes out of, sort of mid-20th century French philosophy, but rather one that can divest itself from some of the implied and explicit humanist principles on which phenomenology rests. So what I propose is a feminist post-human phenomenology. It still is phenomenology because it is a descriptive mode of attuning closely to lived experience. It's a post-human one, though, because it seeks to partially trouble the waters of European humanism and its habits and understandings of embodiment. And out of this emerges this method that I want to talk to you about, by which we might access, amplify, and describe how we live as a watery body in the world. As bodies of water, we disrupt our own sense of embodied self all the time. In the face of fear, the welling up of water in our affective and visceral bodies can result in a sudden and unexpected elimination of tears or pee or shit. And these eruptions might seem beyond the control of the disciplining processes to which we are normally subject as, human selves. Excuse the outburst, we might say, after we tearfully break down. Or we might consider these involuntary evacuations of water from ourselves as a sign of our animality. How unlike me, we might say. We might apologize. A pressing thirst can similarly disorient us and disorient the sense of our organized human selves. Thirst can distract me and diffract me, and I lose my focus, and I can't concentrate on the words on the page or keep my thoughts trained. My throat searches for a little bit of saliva, and I keep trying to swallow, and this is distracting. What did you say? What was that again? We know that in extreme dehydration, the sense of body can altogether recede, and we edge towards a desiccated sort of bare life. In cases where I pass my water on deliberately or intentionally, I might wonder what meaning or what matter am I passing on along with it. These dissolutions of myself into and as the watery world might sort of rest below or beyond my direct and immediate sense of self, but they extend my body into a more expanded sense of self. The tide is rising, we are caught in the waves. Even though our bodies are mostly watery, we hit a plunging threshold that we cannot bear. Too much destratification means a flooded kind of thingification. We lose our grip. But are these kinds of eliminations or withdrawals or transfers or floods something other than me? We could call these experiences a kind of more than human watery embodiment. They do interrupt a comfortable human sense of bodily self, and they amplify our very human vulnerabilities. So in this sense, they're all the more human. But in opening up to these droughts or these seepages, these inundations that are also animal and elemental, we're reminded that our humanness is always more than the bounds of our skin. By turning and paying attention to these disruptions, we attune ourselves empathically towards other bodies of water beyond us. In these instances, one's watery bodiedness spills beyond the discrete comfort of the human, and in doing so, re-emphasizes the flimsy membrane that just barely holds this conceit together, the idea of a body, but which is patrolled and disciplined all the more for it. Such attunement might also include empathy then towards the ocean, forced to carry too much plastic and too little oxygen, or to a whale turned into a toxic vector, or to a river redirected and drained such that it cannot fulfill its responsibilities to provide for its human and other kinds of kin, forcing the river to turn away. Or we could say that by tuning into this watery more than humanness, we also tune into an originary elemental empathy that was always there, latent, swimming below the surface of ourselves. So this kind of phenomenology moves athwart our humanist body's tendency to perceive time, movement, speed, size, and distance as always scaled to a human experience. In his book, The Phenomenology of Perception, Maurice Merleau-Ponty suggests something that he calls a proximal distance. And for Merleau-Ponty, proximal distance is the specific distance between a perceiver and what she perceives, such that an optimal tension is created between the inner horizon of the self and the outer horizon of the thing. So it's where we perceive things just at the perfect distance. For Merleau-Ponty, this proximal distance optimally reveals the thing in its so-called essence. To increase or decrease the proximal distance would mean that we begin to lose a comfortable grip on things, like when we stand too far away from a painting, or we listen to the radio with the volume down too low. While Merleau-Ponty discusses this proximity in a spatial sense, I think we can also understand this idea in terms of an optimal temporality. So, in other words, a nanosecond doesn't really even seem to exist for a human body, and deep time is equally hard for a human-scaled body to fathom. So this proximal distance is expressing a zone of relation between a body and a thing that allows the various interpretive capacities of our bodies to remain optimally held together. You know, we sort of cohere when we experience the world at a proximal distance. For Merleau-Ponty, proximal distance facilitates this cohesion and organization, not just of things in the world as they appear to us, but of our own bodies as well. So this is all how proximal distance works. But as I just described, our bodies are also always falling apart. They dissolve, they extend into things, eventually going beyond our own reach. So my proposition is that a post-human phenomenology can acknowledge our sense of comfort when we appreciate the world from a proximal distance, but at the same time, it pushes a recognition of our lived experience beyond this proximal point. When we slip beyond our comfortable proximal distance, we can better attune to ourselves as also always more than human. In the case of our bodies of water, we may perceive the time of water as immediate and synchronized with our own human-scaled lifespan at first. We might anticipate that the water that makes me up ceases to exist when my flesh and its capacity to imagine a past and a future no longer exists. Other non-Western understandings of the world, ones that have a stronger sense of intergenerationality and deep time, clearly challenge this idea. But for those of us who are steeped in Eurocentrically oriented, atomized ontologies, understanding like what is very small or very large or very near or very distant is tricky. It's tricky to stretch and fathom the time of our bodies of water as extending beyond our proximal comprehension. We know factually that our planetary waters have persisted with nothing added or nothing lost for several billion years. This water holds in it a past as remote as the beginnings of the earth, as well as a future that's unforeseeable. And similarly, we can comfortably perceive the size of water in relation to our human bodies, something we drink or something in which we bathe or something in which we expel from our systems in relatively predictable quantities. And we might, with a little bit more stretching of attention, experience the spatial scale of water at the visceral level as it irrigates our own bodily systems and carries away our waste. But what more could we learn about both ourselves as bodies and about water if we could stretch or shrink this proximal distance further still? So again, post-human phenomenology suggests that really ancient events or unforeseeable futures or water that's too big or too small to easily comprehend, maybe these are not necessarily as distant as they seem. We could think about Japanese researcher Masaru Emoto's practice whereby he takes high-speed photographs of water that capture the unique structures of water crystals right at the moment of their freezing, and just as the water molecules are crystallizing. Emoto's photographs reveal the molecular affect of water and its capacity to hold emotion. When water is in a glass beaker and exposed to the word happiness, Emoto's photograph reveals a crystal that is symmetrical, delicate, exquisitely balanced, and beautiful. When the water is exposed to the word unhappiness, the crystal appears out of balance and only partially formed. Exposure to different kinds of music, melancholy or discordant, similarly results in differently affected crystals. I mean, this is wild. Like, is this just a good story? Well, maybe. Or maybe Masaru Emoto's photos reveal this intercorporeal, this relational embodiment of a feeling experienced at a more than human scale. These torqued scales of watery connection appear in other ways too that are equally provocative. For example, in anthropologist Elizabeth Povinelli's story of Chipel, a creek in northern Australia, a creek that is also a young woman, possibly a transgender person. Despite embodying an entirely other than human spatio-temporal scale, Chipel, the creek, responds to the human bodies that live beside her and with her. And Beth Povinelli describes how some of Chipel's Aboriginal human kin seek to be responsive to her, and how they are certainly affected by Chipel's own capacity to alter her arrangement of existence as a creek, drying up or turning away as a response to human actions. So this is also a kind of more than human, intercorporeal, affective relationship between different kinds of bodies of water. In order to understand Chipel's capacity to be affected, human bodies require a sensibility of water at a more than human scale. This manipulation of our proximal relationship to things also brings us back to what French philosopher Gilles Deleuze would call the virtual. For Deleuze, the virtual is a body's indeterminate potentialities, right? That accompany everything that it actually is, right? So the virtual are those unknowable or ungraspable times and spaces that have not yet been realized. Those potential routes that, for example, our bodies of water did not take, but might have in a prehistoric past or in an unknowable future, or in a body of water that is too near or too far to be part of what I consider to be my body. All of these potential expressions of a body are actually held by my actual body. So what do I mean by this? I mean, as such, the virtual, this idea of a potential body of water, it's neither fully graspable or desirable. But if we think about virtuality as, or in relation to bodies of water, then the distinction between the actual body and the virtual or the potential one becomes blurry, because, you know, we might wonder, are those nanoscopic, like very small or prehistoric watery expressions of my body actual, but just ungraspable by me? Or are they virtual because they are ungraspable by me, and because they seem to me to be more like a might have been? So what I'm trying to say here is that in a system such as waters, which is both open, all the water in the world, and closed, in the sense that water always takes up a specific expression, water endlessly cycles and repeats all the time, becoming different. And in this situation, the distinction between what was and what might have been, or what is and what could be, is not really that clear. If I share one molecule of water with a tsunami that occurred thousands of years ago on the other side of the world, is that tsunami part of my body's virtuality, its could have been, or part of its actuality, what it actually is? So these molecules of actuality are always channeling through the potentiality, and vice versa. I'm not saying this in order to quibble with Deleuze, but I rather want to insist that even post-human virtuality is always, in a sense, lived. The distinction between virtual and actual but ungraspable isn't actually maybe that important. Both demand that I stretch my comfortable human scales of spatial and temporal proximity. Both demand a way to tap into my bodily more than humanness that is lived, even if it's difficult to grasp and hold those experiences. I propose that this is a kind of phenomenology that can help us contact those experiences, even if only ephemerally or at a slight remove. The method of post-human phenomenology allows us to access, amplify, and describe. So how? Well, a good place to start is embodied attunement. Eminent phenomenologist Herbert Spiegelberg refers to phenomenological intuiting as the act of utter concentration on a thing without becoming so absorbed that you no longer look critically. This is a basic phenomenological instruction as a way of remaining open to the wonder of a phenomenon and to bracket that natural attitude that I mentioned before. This intuiting demands that we tap into our lived experience, albeit one that's mostly covered over. And I learned about this practice from a teacher of mine named Sam Mallon, who taught me a method called body hermeneutics 15 years ago. Sam posited that there were 4 ways that a body existed in the world. The first, through cognition or logical thinking. The second, through perception or sensing. Third, through affect or feeling. And finally, fourth, through moving, moving a body and how it relates to the world in movement. According to Sam's method, I could start to amplify my own body as a body of water by asking, how does the body of water look or feel or taste? How does it move when it's excessively lubricated or very, very thirsty? How does it feel as water escapes it in tears or piss or vomit? For example, I can home into the way my body changes as I drink a glass of water. But at some point, this attention becomes strained, and I probably experience what seems to be a disappearance of the water somewhere inside me. But what happens if I pay even closer attention and fine-tune my sensory apparatuses, don't I also sense a wet weight at my center? A certain tension in my skull eases. My movements are less sluggish. All of these techniques of attunement require persistence and repetition, and they're useful and they're interesting, but what is useful and interesting needs to be teased out, poked, prodded, and coaxed from those experiences into a kind of descriptive practice. Sam's practice of body hermeneutics and other versions of phenomenological method can be a good starting point then to access what it means to be a body of water. Access, amplify, describe. But in a very practical sense, it's not immediately clear how this method could help access those experiences that are, again, beyond or below that proximal distance, that human scaled perception. How do I grasp the virtual? How can I trace the wateriness of that distant past or that unknowable future, that microscopic internal seascape? How can I map the transits of water that happen out of view or out of focus, the workings of my spinal fluid that occupies my subarachnoid space, or the journey of my medicated urine into estuaries and communities downstream from me, or the dissipation of my sweat into a humid forest atmosphere to exchange wet breaths with the ancient oak trees. When I try to move deeper or further back or more extensively out, things get complicated. And in these cases, human scaled thinking and my sensing body needs help. So in order to get that help, I suggest something that I call proxy stories. Proxy stories can be avenues for loosening the grip on our human scaled perspective. These stories are not substitutes for embodied experience, but they're amplifiers and sensitizers. Art, for example, is a great amplifier. One experience of water could go something like this. Between two rooms hangs a curtain, hundreds of strings of crystalline blue beads plummeting freely, but in unison, to the gallery floor, all searching for the lowest place, the path of least resistance. I position myself in the middle of this curtain and let this cataract pour itself over me, a baptism of string and glass. I can't move. Beneath this persistent pressure, I'm prevented from floating away. I feel the weight of water in a way that grounds me, pulls me down, pulls me under. Even though this water, which is actually an installation by Felix González Torres that I experienced in the Koffler Gallery in Toronto on a summer afternoon in 2002, even though this water isn't wet, it activates and amplifies in me the lived experience of water as undertow, as stronger than my own measly self. Or how about this? Projected behind a wall of cascading water, Rebekka Belmore gathers the sea in a bucket and grunting and struggling throws it at me, the viewer. A thick, ropey red runs down the screen, and I feel the waters of my white settler body flow into the colonized waters of this place I live, Turtle Island, also known as Canada. Belmore's video installation, Fountain, which I'm just describing here, allows me to access and amplify my own watery politics of location, channeling through my corporeal seas. So writing, images, objects, other art forms can work in these ways, giving us access to an embodied experience of our wateriness that might otherwise feel too submerged, too subcutaneous, too repressed, too large or too distant, or even too obvious to readily sense. A drought experienced at the back of a parched throat, a fishy ancestor swimming up my unfolding vertebrate body, a glacier melting felt in my own gut. The desire to draw on these stories does not represent a failure of phenomenology to get back to the things themselves. Rather, I think they affirm that these stories are also pulled from a material world, but condensed, concentrated, and given back to my bodily experience in a way that I can more readily access and amplify. So art can be an amplifier, but so too can science in a slightly different way. While notable exceptions persist and proliferate, phenomenologists are generally critical of the scientific empiricist view. Natural scientific explanations of bodies are not, at face value anyways, particularly aligned with a phenomenological understanding of lived experience. Merleau-Ponty himself says that reliance on phenomenological description over analysis and explanation must at the start forswear science. But this post-human phenomenology that I'm trying to describe holds that scientific and phenomenological practice are not necessarily incompatible. Sociologist Ulrich Beck noted that many of our contemporary embodied experience require what he calls the sensory organs of science, theories, experiments, measurements, in order for those facts to become visible or interpretable to us. Feminist environmental thinker Stacy Alaimo, drawing on the work of Ulrich Beck, also says that we need these kinds of syncretic assemblages of knowledge in order to understand how our own bodies are implicated in a world that isn't easily grasped through one mode of inquiry alone. So perhaps there isn't so wide a gap between the attunement of phenomenologists and the work of scientists who both are staring at wonder in the face of the world. Perhaps scientific knowledge and phenomenology are one of these syncretic assemblages. Experiences of bodily waters below and beyond the human scale, as I've said, are also lived experience. But if some scientific findings, such as those of evolutionary biology, organic chemistry, molecular physics, if some of these findings seem too abstract or imperceptible or distant to be verified through my embodied experience, this is only because the human-centered and human-scaled perception dominates that experience. To assume that bacterial life or meteorology or biochemistry is not lived in some way in and through my extended embodiment either underestimates how we understand bodies or misunderstands what it means to live. Because even science that seems really distant from our embodied experience, for example, science from the benthos of the deepest part of the ocean, even if it seems far away, it only makes sense to us because we have an embodied capacity to feel, to know, to understand. Artist Rona Lee, for example, talks about research done by the National Oceanography Center at Southampton, and talks about the emotional response and imaginative projection that informs this oceanography. To quote Lee, "One colleague told me of how the sight of a small jellyfish floating weightlessly along at a depth of 30,000 meters had led him to reflect on the impact of gravity as symbolized by the return to earth of death. It shapes our consciousness and how we evolved in an aquatic medium. Buoyancy would have given rise to an unthinkable different kind of metaphysics." She also speaks of an instance when the temperature of a black smoker, an undersea hydrothermal vent, was brought home by a scientist, not because he was reading the gauges on his instrument panel, but because he was watching a length of ducting tape attached to a piece of external equipment slowly melt away, activating an imagined sensation of the extreme heat that was involved. So in other words, science is also sensuous. Relationships and process that govern the world we inhabit are all in some way lived directly, intensively, virtually, imaginatively by us. In line with Merleau-Ponty, the world makes sense to us in all of its wonders only because we are embodied. At the same time, how we exist and understand ourselves as embodied beings is not an inert, static, or enduring kind of truth. Like our bodies themselves, our embodied knowledge of our bodies and how we experience them is always becoming, shifting, and changing. In these contemporary times, when we are increasingly living our bodies as fragmentable, augmentable, extendable, and also fungible in ways that are mostly new or new incarnations of old tricks, we have to come to understand how we know our bodies differently as well. Organ transplantation, biobanking, assisted reproduction, for example, all of these fragment our bodies in new ways and put pressures on some of our commonly held notions of bodily integrity. At the same time, we're becoming increasingly aware of our embodiment as intimately linked to and visited by environmental others, animals, bacteria, plastics, and toxins. The insides of our viscera are now available to us in microscopic detail, and we can trace the chemical markers of our psychopharmaceutically enhanced urine just as it disperses through local watersheds, or COVID-laced urine, as we've also recently learned. The neglect of those watersheds or callous indifference to how they are becoming polluted might then also become something that we experience in or as our own watery vulnerability. So all of these changes aren't outside of our lived embodiment. The ways we understand what it means to be a body and the different maps that our bodies chart and the inextricability that we have from the complex webs of relation in which we exist, these are all lived by us in phenomenologically relevant ways. I mean, put otherwise, it would be absurd to think that our bodies somehow change, while our means for knowing our bodies don't. Our minds, our tongues, our language, our hearts, these don't remain static either. The miniature video camera that goes down one's throat creates a new relationship to one's stomach. The implantation of another person's kidney shifts and radicalizes the experience of intersubjectivity in really important ways. 3D ultrasound inaugurates different understandings of a maternal eye. Could we not imagine a similar sort of reconfiguration, one that stretches and disperses our bodies, when we read how our human waste or our toxic emissions are transforming entire ocean ecosystems? By paying attention to the measurement of water levels in our reservoirs or our lakes, might our own thirst be imagined as a more extensive, collaborative gullet? Our bodies of water clearly demonstrate that the I, the self, is both technological and ecological, connected up with other bodies of all kinds. And the sensorium that opens to us through technology and through other types of monitoring and assessment changes how we actually experience our bodies, because we take on these schematizations and we integrate them into our ways of being in the world. In other words, once the mediating tools of science and technology are brought into our sphere of experience, we cannot help but experience our bodies and ourselves differently. So the use of biological, chemical, or other scientific tools and information to amplify and extend human-scaled experience not only reconfigures our understanding of embodiment, but it also gives us resources that helps us access, amplify, and describe our bodies as post-human. Because these scientific knowledges stretch and shrink our human proximal relation to certain matters or forces, we can grapple with these accounts and nudge ourselves closer to appreciating those experiences in a way that doesn't easily conform to a humanist one. These scientific perspectives can teach me something about the mechanics of fluids, the chemical composition of water, the ecological hydrological cycle, but they can also facilitate a different understanding of me. For example, while I might lose my grip on the water that I drink from a glass as it travels into my belly, the science of pharmacokinetics helps me understand the mechanisms, times, and processes of absorption. Evolutionary biology can remind me that I descend from cyanobacteria and can amplify the lived duration of my bodily waters far beyond my own grip on them. My mammalian diving reflex allows me to dive to depths much deeper than most animals, thanks to a marked reduction in heart rate and cardiac output that reduces my body's oxygen consumption. And this scientific explanation doesn't invent the experiences of my body as I move from land to deep water, but I can experience the science as an embodied fact. These science stories help me tap into, amplify this phenomenon that was already there, swimming in the waters of my flesh. So these reciprocal, but always imperfect, exchanges between scientific knowledge and phenomenology are tools of phenomenological attunement that can help us shift our experience of ourselves as human. The edges of a discretely bounded self begins to blur. Our own skin becomes increasingly transparent. Phenomenology may not require this amplification, but these amplifiers enhance rather than annul phenomenology's insights into what it means to be a body. In fact, as Donna Haraway taught us many decades ago, all knowledge is prosthetic. All knowledge is mediated by things that help us focus on this or experience that. We only know the world because it is mediated by prosthetics. There is no pre-mediated state to go back to. I mean, no less than the specific power of a primate retina, an optic nerve, can mediate what we think we perceive. Microscopes and telescopes similarly give us access to certain visions and hold other ones at bay. So both a tongue and a water quality autosampler, both a sensitive fingertip and a DNA sequencer, are sensory apparatuses that give us information about the world and extend our embodiment. And this holds for all sensory apparatuses: language, cosmology, ideology, imagination. These are all also mediating prostheses that open up certain experiences for us and restrain others. So just as post-humanist phenomenology reminds phenomenology, humanist phenomenology, that all knowledge is mediated and human-scaled essences and proximal distances are just a force of habit that lead us to think of the body as a discrete and bounded thing, post-human phenomenology also reminds post-humanists that we cannot transcend the body's embeddedness within a context. That is, while we are always extended, we are also always very specifically situated. We experience embodiment within specific contexts and structures of power that cannot be transcended. A post-human method can no more easily escape our situation than a phenomenological one can. And this is why this method that I'm talking about of access and amplification is also feminist. When we access, amplify, and describe ourselves as bodies of water, we always need to remain attuned to the differences of racialized, colonized, gendered bodies. And our amplifications have to trace rather than erase these differences. Flight from one's specifically situated human body is not feminist posthumanism. It's an arrogant fantasy. This is to say, situated knowledge is a fierce politics of location These are the foundations of this method I'm describing. A feminist post-human phenomenological method insists on describing the social, morphological, cultural, biological, structural, imaginative conditions that enable certain experiences for some bodies, but not for all. Not all bodies can access or describe or amplify in the same way. So paying attention to these differences also teaches us something about watery embodiment. In other words, not only do we require science to help understand our more than human scaled waters that we live, but we also need to attune ourselves critically to the differences of bodies that together world our planetary hydrocommons, even or especially as our bodies dissipate and destratify and defy and interrupt our sense of a coherently bounded self. The flows of power and restratification that differentiate us are never washed away. A feminist post-human phenomenology cannot remain tethered to a bounded I, but it must also challenge a too easy we. I'm just going to wrap up now. If the aim of feminist post-human phenomenology is to attune ourselves differently to the world in which we are implicated, and to experiment in modes of being otherwise through this access, amplification, and description, the question remains, what do these descriptions do? What can they change, and how can they illuminate and produce more ethical accounts of how we can live well together? Post-human phenomenology can be a tool for thinking with environmental matters, such as water, in order to transform the contours and limits of modes of inquiry that are humanist. But it can also be a transformation of ethics. To refigure ourselves as bodies of water is not only an experiment in a different kind of human embodiment, but it's also a feminist commitment to following the flows of marginalization or injustice, but also of connection, empowerment, and joy that our watery bodies collaboratively engender. Thank you.